Good evening. Thanks for coming on such a beautiful spring evening. My name is Brig Gebert, and I would like to welcome you on behalf of the Friends of the Institute. Our speaker tonight is especially exciting because he is the Friends-supported member this year in the School of Social Science, Seth Moglen, Associate Professor in the Department of English at Lehigh University, Pennsylvania. Having studied history as an undergraduate at Yale University and as a graduate student at Balliol College, Oxford University, Moglen received his PhD in English at the University of California, Berkeley in 1999. Moglen's research, like his teaching, is centrally concerned with relationships between expressive culture and the politics of liberation. He has published scholarly articles on 20th century American literature, on left politics in the US and Britain, and on psychoanalytic theory. He's the author of Mourning Modernity, Literary Modernism and the Injuries of American Capitalism. Of course, they picked the German one to read this. The topic he chose for tonight is Bethlehem, American Utopia, American Tragedy. And I'm as curious as you all are to listen what our distinguished speaker has to share with us. Professor Seth Moglen. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Can people in the back hear me? And are you getting some reverb from the mic? You're good? Okay. Thank you, Brig. It's a great pleasure to be here with you all tonight. And I'd like, of course, to begin by thanking the friends of the Institute, many of whom are here tonight, I take it, for your generous support for my work here at the School of Social Science. I wanted just to take a brief moment to say something about being here at the Institute, which all of you, since it's a matter of course, may to some degree take for granted. It's a really, truly extraordinary gift to have a year at the Institute. It's, of course, most obviously the gift of time. It's a gift of liberation from the ordinary demands of faculty life, a chance to focus your best energies day after day on your own creative intellectual work, which virtually never happens in the ordinary run of faculty life. It's also an extraordinary interdisciplinary community, and it's the gift of an opportunity to step away from the narrow confines of your ordinary disciplinary practice to talk with colleagues from other disciplines about the really large issues. IAS has, in this sense, really created to a remarkable degree those very rare, very precious conditions, a mixture of liberty and a kind of intellectual cross-fertilization that makes fundamental research possible. It's an extraordinary privilege to be here, and I want to thank you all for your contributions in making this possible. I've been working this year on two different but very strongly related projects, and at the risk of stretching myself thin tonight, I want to try to talk with you about both of them. First of all, I'm a member of the Dewey Seminar in the School of Social Science, which is an enterprise led with remarkable vision and energy by Danielle Allen. Members of the seminar's theme, as many of you know, is education, schools, and the state. And members of the seminar are exploring a wide range of issues, but I think most fundamentally, we're wrestling with the problem of democracy and education. I'm specifically interested in the question of what truly democratic research universities might look like in the 21st century. My own work in this area is based to a large degree on an experiment in university-community collaboration, a quite practical experiment that I direct at Lehigh, which is a mid-sized private university located in Bethlehem, as many of you know. I'm going to talk some about that collaborative project, I want to tell you something about its practical features, but I also want to tell you about the broader vision of the democratic university that I think is emerging from it, and about which I've been writing this year. The second thing I want to talk about is the book that I'm devoting most of my energy to this year, which is a book about the city of Bethlehem, And it's a book which has emerged very directly from this project of collaboration, which is called the South Side Initiative. In the latter portion of my talk, I'll talk some about the book, and I'll read you a very brief segment of the manuscript. In order to talk about both of these projects, I need to tell you a fair amount about the history of Bethlehem, which my book seeks to capture. So the talk, which has several parts, will begin with the history of the city, and then I'll talk about the Southside Initiative, and then about my book. So let me just begin by orienting you in the most general way. Bethlehem is located in eastern Pennsylvania. It's about 75 miles due west of Manhattan and about 60 miles north of Philadelphia. It's a little over an hour's drive from Princeton. Let me tell you a little bit about its history. Bethlehem was founded in 1741 as a utopian religious community by the Moravians. The Moravians were a pietist, Central European Protestant sect. Bethlehem, which you see represented here in a drawing made in the early 1750s, Bethlehem was one of the most egalitarian places in European North America. The Moravians created a communal economy in which everyone in the city worked for the community and received on equal terms not only food, shelter, and clothing, but also equal access to a free system of education, child care, health care, and care for the elderly. Amazingly enough, and I believe this is genuinely no exaggeration, no one in 18th century Bethlehem feared poverty or destitution in old age or illness. There was also an exceptional degree of gender symmetry in Moravian Bethlehem. Women had been intentionally freed from the burden of privatized child care and domestic labor in order to enable them to assume leadership roles in the community, both spiritual and social. It was a surprisingly integrated, multiracial town in which Africans, Native Americans, and Europeans from 20 countries lived, worked, worshipped, and learned together. This 18th century city of immigrants had 100% literacy in the 1750s, male as well as female, across all racial groups. In contrast to the usual story of failed utopias, which nearly all of us are, I suspect, familiar, this egalitarian community was economically extraordinarily successful, and indeed it was perhaps the most technologically advanced place in European North America. In 1750, the time at which this sketch was made, in the early 1750s, roughly 700 people sustained 60 different industries and crafts, nearly all of them water-powered. Bethlehem also had, as far as I can tell, the first systematic municipal water supply of anywhere in North America. People like John Adams and Ben Franklin kept coming back and writing letters to people saying, you have to come and check this out. These are some pictures of what 18th century Bethlehem, the buildings in 18th century Bethlehem as they look today. This is the often referred to as the industrial quarter. These are among the largest and most impressive buildings in early 18th century Pennsylvania, certainly outside anywhere other than Philadelphia. These house several different industries, all of them powered by the Monocacy Creek. This is a photograph of a rather representative building because the Moravians lived entirely communally. The living structures are virtually all quite large and impressive stone buildings. This is the Single Brothers house that was built in 1742. I must add immediately that the egalitarianism of this community, which I have so far emphasized, was compromised and undermined in emblematically American ways from the very outset. This was a slave-holding society. Most of those literate Africans whom I have described, who lived in conditions of rough material equality with their European contemporaries, and who lived, among other things, here in the Single Brothers house, most of those Africans were held as chattel slaves by the church. It was a town built on land that had been stolen from the native people, the Lenni Lenape, in an especially cynical manner. And despite its prosperity and economic success, the communal economy was dismantled after one generation by the church leaders in Germany. And the ensuing privatization, the leaders in Germany insisted on privatizing the community and that everybody return to a more conventional individual and family existence. Privatization led to the immediate collapse, not only of economic equality in the city of Bethlehem, but also to the total collapse of gender equality in the city. This all took place in the 1760s. Part two. This is not Moravian Bethlehem, as you've probably gathered. Okay, 100 years later, in the late 19th century, Bethlehem became one of the iconic steel towns of industrial America. It was home to Bethlehem Steel, one of the world's largest steel companies and one of the wealthiest corporations in American history. Bethlehem Steel played an especially important role in the development of structural steel. As many of you may know, the Bethlehem Steel's iconic product was the I-beam. These structural steel members made possible the skyscrapers, suspension bridges, and battleships of 20th century America. For a century, every aspect of life in the city of Bethlehem revolved around Bethlehem Steel. This is a picture of the relatively early stage of the steel plant, as you can see, from 1907. It created extraordinary wealth for its owners and for its very large managerial class. Many of the wealthiest Americans, indeed, in the middle of the 20th century, many of the wealthiest Americans were Bethlehem Steel executives, and they built their mansions, of which there are a great many, on the north side of the river, and you can see them today. The steel also created livelihoods for tens of thousands of working-class immigrants from dozens of nations who poured into South Bethlehem to work at the steel. The steel, by the way, is not an idiosyncratic term on my part. It's how the steel plant is universally known, as if it's a kind of force of nature in the city of Bethlehem. These immigrants built extraordinarily tight-knit, intergenerationally sustained ethnic neighborhoods. Many of the houses in South Bethlehem were built by immigrant families with their neighbors, and most of them were actually built collectively. For example, in my neighborhood, all of the houses up and down the street on which I live were built by this same village of people who came from Slovakia together, and they built first one family's house and then another at night when they got off the second shift at the steel. So these neighborhoods have been very sustained and long-lasting. What's quite remarkable is that on the south side today, and this came as a great surprise to me as a native New Yorker, if you speak to almost any elderly person in South Bethlehem, they are likely to be living in the house in which they were quite literally born in 80 or 90 years ago. In the early 20th century, there was extraordinarily intense, even by early 20th century American standards, there was extraordinarily intense economic exploitation in the city of Bethlehem. Steelmaking, as many of you know, is extremely dangerous work. People worked very long hours for relatively low wages. If you ask any old-timer on the south side, he or she will tell you at a moment's notice that his or her father earned exactly 96 cents a day for a 14-hour shift. There was, as a result, also an extremely long and intense history of labor organizing in South Bethlehem and of particularly fierce anti-union violence. The city was run for years at a time, as were most coal towns and steel towns in the United States, by private armies called the Coal and Iron Police, which makes up a rather remarkable phase of the record of American industrial relations. I wanted to show you a couple of photographs. These were taken. Walker Evans was quite intoxicated by Bethlehem. When he didn't know what to do in the early 30s with his time, he would come back to Bethlehem to take more pictures. Here are a couple of photographs that Evans took in the early 30s of the city of Bethlehem, which have come to be written about quite extensively by scholars of American studies. These sort of iconic images of what it means to live and die literally in the shadow of massive industries. These are buildings on the south side of Bethlehem, and you can see the blast furnaces behind. The steel was finally unionized in 1941 during the Second World War because of a particularly violent strike and intervention by the Roosevelt administration. As a result, for 50 years, there were good union jobs at Bethlehem Steel. There was good pay, there was improved safety, there was health care, and there were pension plans. Bethlehem became, to an extraordinary degree, one of the great models of post-war working class American prosperity. Steelworkers began to send their kids to college by the thousands. Here are a couple of photographs taken in the early 50s by Life magazine, 1951. This is workers leaving, 10,000 men, all the workers in the early 50s, with the exception of a few clerical workers, were men. 10,000 men coming on and off work 3 times a day, over 30,000 people a day working at Beth Steel at the main plant. Very hard to capture the scale of a steel plant in a photograph. The vast, vast scale of these things is quite awe-inspiring. In the 1980s and 90s, there was a crisis in the American steel industry as a result of international competition, as well as competition from non-union mini mills in the South, which resulted in the gradual scaling back and ultimate closure of the Bethlehem Steel plant. The last cast took place in 1995. A few years later, in 2001, the parent company, Bethlehem Steel, went bankrupt, and it was one of the pioneers of a particular bankruptcy strategy, which, as many of you know, has now become normative among many American corporations. It was Bethlehem Steel who successfully convinced the courts that they should be able to sell off their assets, which mostly meant mines, buildings, machinery, and to shed their pension plans and health plans, their commitments to their retirees. The result of this was that in 2003, virtually overnight, tens of thousands of former Bethlehem Steel employees lost their pensions and health plans. They lost, in short, the economic and personal security, which had been above every other consideration the reason they had given lifetimes of work to the steel. This is, as I've indicated, this is what the Bethlehem Steel plant looks like today. The blast furnaces, again, it's very hard to get a sense of scale, although the railroad cars may give you a sense of this. The blast furnaces are 7 or 8 stories high. This building here, this is machine shop number 2. This building is more than 2 football fields in length, and it's a single room. The closing of the steel cost tens of thousands of jobs, but not sudden, catastrophic overnight unemployment of the kind that we saw, of course, in places like Flint or Detroit. Rather, over a decade, there was a gradual shift to low-paid non-union labor and the rise of very substantial poverty once again on the South Side for the first time in half a century. Today, more than 25% of those living on the South Side of Bethlehem, and well over half of the children living on the South Side, are living below the official poverty line. The South Side suffers from many related social problems, including failing public schools, serious public health problems, including epidemics of asthma and diabetes. I was recently told, and this really astounded me, that there are over 100 homeless children attending school every day now in South Bethlehem. South Bethlehem has 2 quite small public elementary schools and 1 mid-sized junior high school. 100 homeless children who are attending school regularly. The former Bethlehem Steel site is today the largest urban brownfield in the United States. It's over 100 acres at the very heart of a rather small city. The massive ruins of the steel plant, which you can see here, which had been the center of work, of livelihoods, of social organization in the city for a century, went dead. Now, I'll say a little bit more in a moment about what has happened subsequently to the steel site and to the south side, but I want to make a small digression to talk a little bit about Lehigh University. Lehigh University is located in the middle of South Bethlehem, right in the midst of this vibrant, multi-ethnic, working-class community, and it's had a very complex and paradoxical historical relationship to the south side. Oops. I meant to show this earlier. This is another this is another picture of the ruins of the Bethlehem Steel site, and we'll give you some sense of the really ghostly, rather sublime feeling of what it's like to walk around on the steel site today. Here, as you can see, is a postcard of Lehigh University in 1907, the same year as that early photograph of the Bethlehem Steel plant. This is only 8 blocks or so from the steel plant. Founded in the 1860s, Lehigh's early development was closely tied to Bethlehem Steel. Its early strength was in engineering. It produced both the engineers and the technical knowledge that made Bethlehem Steel one of the most profitable steel producers and indeed one of the most profitable corporations in the world. While Lehigh thus played a very important role in creating massive profits for the steel, the Bethlehem Steel Corporation also gave large sums of money to the university, the bulk indeed of its endowment. Steel executives served on the Board of Trustees continuously and in a dominant role from its founding until fairly late into the 20th century. The building of an elite private research university played an important symbolic role for the Steel's managerial class as a way of accumulating and displaying cultural capital. And this is, of course, a story strongly related to that of other late 19th and early 20th century American research universities, including Stanford, Duke, Carnegie Mellon, and so on. Even as the university was intimately tied to Bethlehem Steel and helped to create jobs for tens of thousands of workers, it largely closed its gates to the working people of South Bethlehem, who rarely, not never, but rarely had the financial or educational resources to attend. These dynamics led to a long history of class segregation on the South Side, a history which will be very familiar to many of you from other university towns across the country. Though this had a special intimacy and geographical visibility in Bethlehem, where a wealthy private university serving a regional East Coast elite was located right in the middle of a heavily immigrant, multi-ethnic working class community, and the steel itself is visible from many, many places in the university campus. Lehigh does not have locked gates, as Yale University did when I was an undergraduate, in order to maintain the separation between members of the university and members of the city. But the border between the university and the city was for generations policed with very intense vigilance, especially in the first half of the 20th century. I've interviewed many Southside residents over the last 2 years, and many, many of them will tell the story of being either arrested or harassed by police walking across the campus on their way home, either from school or from their shift at the Steel. Another crucial episode in university community relations, and one which I knew very little about when I started my work on the South Side, but came to need to understand in some detail, took place in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s as Lehigh expanded its campus. Like many other private universities around the country, and Danielle Allen has actually written about how this took place at the University of Chicago, for example. Columbia has a similar history. Lehigh worked very closely with the city government to employ eminent domain powers to declare adjacent working class neighborhoods derelict. The city seized whole blocks, indeed whole neighborhoods, which were then bought at a discount by the university, which built new sections of its campus. Now, over the last 2 or 3 decades, Lehigh, like many other private universities in recent years, began to take quite serious steps to develop more positive relations with its neighbors on the South Side, and this has taken many forms, many, many interesting projects. Perhaps most prominently, these have taken the form of community service activities, especially under the auspices of the Community Service Office, which organizes student volunteer work. There's an enormous amount of very good, very constructive work being done through the Community Service Office of all kinds. I very much admire this work, but one thing I do feel the need to note is that much of this work has unfortunately had the unintended effect in some ways of reinforcing and intensifying some of the hierarchical social dynamics between people in the city and people at the university. And in fact, those of you who may have heard Didier Fassin's talk in which he offered a critique of humanitarian reason, and Didier was talking mainly about the functioning of international public health organizations, one of the things that I was struck by is the resonance of this with regard to many kinds of community service projects undertaken today by U.S. universities, and that may be something people would be interested in talking about. In any event, after a decade of abandonment, the Steel site was purchased in 2004 by a New York-based real estate conglomerate. Within days of the purchase, it was revealed that the major stakeholder was in fact the Las Vegas Sands Corporation, one of the largest casino enterprises in the United States, which was filing for a license to open a casino on the former steel site. The state of Pennsylvania had just legalized casino gambling officially as a strategy for post-industrial urban and regional redevelopment. As many of you know, states all over the country have legalized casino gambling as an effort to raise government revenues to pay for common needs at a time when Americans are increasingly reluctant to raise taxes. The Las Vegas Sands Corporation secured the license, and they have today built a casino right in the middle of the Bethlehem Steel site at the center of a toxic brownfield. This is a publicity. I'll show you two publicity photographs of the Sands Casino. What's very interesting is that all of the Sands publicity photographs, they've been very, very intensively photoshopped in order to make the brownfield and all of this vast, I mean, the steel site is 10 miles long, in order to make the rest of the steel site go away. So if you look at these images, these are images of the casino, although I have to note that these buildings never got built. The casino ran out of money. But these are the sort of publicity images of the casino. If you go a few steps, actually I should go back, if you go even just a few steps over here, this is what you see, which is these massive towering dead steel buildings in the midst of which the casino has been built. This is a photograph of the inside of the casino. It's a single, at the moment the casino is only a slot machine parlor. This is a vast warehouse of a building. It's very difficult to describe just how big it is. It contains nothing but slot machines. The casino spent $700 million building this building, and the idea was that it should echo the feeling of the steel plant itself. So what's quite interesting is, as you can see, there was no shortage of large industrial buildings on this steel site, but this is the inside of the casino today. I should also note one of the ultimate ironies about the casino is that they couldn't get hold of enough domestically produced steel to build it, so it was built with Japanese and Korean steel. There's a lesson of some kind in that. Okay, but I want to take a step back. I sort of rushed ahead because I had to show you pictures of the casino. I couldn't give this talk and not show you the pictures of the casino. In 2005, though, so immediately when it had been announced that there was going to be a casino, but the casino hadn't been built, the city of Bethlehem had arrived at a decisive turning point in its history. The redevelopment of the heart of the city, and again, I want to remind you, we're talking about 100 acres, over 100 acres in the middle of a small city, appeared to be entirely in private hands, a casino corporation now replacing the Steel, as were many of the most important decisions about the future of the city. There were competing positive and negative scenarios circulating wildly in the city. The official view was that the casino would bring tax revenue, it would create jobs, that they had the resources to develop the site, that it would be an anchor for urban development, and so on. There were enormously anxious, paranoid views about what would happen. People said the city will be overrun by prostitution and by crime and by traffic, and the urban core will collapse. So there were a lot of competing responses. Bethlehem residents had very mixed responses, as you might guess. Some were enormously excited and some were terrified. But what was virtually universally the case in my experience was that there was a sense of almost total powerlessness. People in the city had the sense that the steel site, around which their lives and the lives of generations of their family had revolved for generations, and the entire future of the city, that all of these decisions would be made without their having any opportunity to exercise any meaningful form of influence. This is a slightly more positive picture of the South Side today. I didn't want to show you only the grim Walker Evans pictures of South Bethlehem. There's a picture of South Bethlehem. So it was in that context, this context of this sense of a sort of pervasive feeling of powerlessness in the city, at least as I saw it, that a group of us launched the South Side Initiative. We often refer to it as SSI, and that's what I mean when I use those initials in the talk. We launched this initiative. A group of faculty, mostly in the humanities and social sciences, but including natural scientists, engineers, people from the business school, began to meet systematically with community leaders and residents throughout the city in order to understand what role the university might play at this moment of extraordinary change in the life of the city. We met with local politicians, the mayor, the city council, business leaders of many, many different kinds, community groups, nonprofits, church groups, environmental organizations, direct service providers, immigrant aid groups. We met with as many people as we could throughout the city, and we asked them two questions. First, we said, what kind of knowledge do people in the city of Bethlehem need in order to understand what is actually taking place in their city? And how might a research university help them to produce, to disseminate, and to gain access to that knowledge? Second, how could a university help to create more space for active democratic deliberation and decision-making at this moment of transformation? Was there some way in which the university could enable people around the city, including people at the university, to feel as if they had some greater measure of control over what promised to be the complete transformation of Bethlehem? So in response to what we learned, we set up a bunch of programs which involved many, many things that universities ordinarily do, right? We brought in visiting speakers, we held public forums, we had public events of various kinds, we had classes, we had working groups. We did these kinds of things that universities commonly do, but all of the activities, everything that we have done over the last 3 years was developed in close collaboration with people in the community, and in particular with residents living in the South Side neighborhoods near Lehigh. All of these focused on topics that had been identified as matters of pressing concern to people in the city, and each was organized in order to maximize opportunity for faculty and students to come together with community members to exchange different forms of knowledge and to deliberate on challenges facing the city. Visiting speakers, for example, were invited to give conventional academic talks in the specialized language of their discipline where that was appropriate, but everyone who came was also asked to participate in public forums where they would share knowledge through dialogue with community members, public officials, and so on. And I'll say more about that in a moment. We offered a series of courses. Now it's been over 35 courses over the last 3 years in which Lehigh faculty and student academic expertise would be focused on pressing challenges facing the South Side. And very rapidly we realized that it was imperative that these courses be team taught by faculty members and community members so that you didn't have this familiar dynamic in which students become sort of privileged observers and the community becomes the object of academic inquiry. And it also became very clear to us that it was imperative that members of the community be able to participate in classes freely, which is to say without cost. Working groups similarly brought together faculty and students along with community members to engage in multi-year collective enterprises to work on problems which had been identified in public forums or in courses. What I want to do is just describe one example of our work in a little bit of detail, and then I'm going to move on from this. But I wanted to give you some sense of the texture and of the way in which these different enterprises work together. And then I want to say something about the vision of the university. Because of the urgency of the topic, during the initiative's first year, we brought together leading experts on casinos who shared the results of their research on the actual effects of casino development in towns and communities across the United States and around the world. At one public forum, for example, attended by hundreds of community members, the leading historian of Atlantic City, right, who knew that there was a historian of Atlantic City, but there are several. The leading historian of Atlantic City, a guy named Brian Simon, who teaches at Temple, explained in detail how and why casinos, which had been brought in to revive that city, had actually destroyed the urban core. I don't know if any of you have been to Atlantic City, but you may have a sense of what I'm talking about. He laid out the specific dynamics of land speculation that had led to the inflation of house prices and rents, and then had led catastrophically to the laying waste of whole neighborhoods. He explained the dynamics by which restaurants, bars, movie theaters, and grocery stores had been driven out of business. Brian told me that there is today not a single functioning grocery store in the city limits of Atlantic City. He explained, too, how and why Atlantic City's municipal government had less revenue to spend on social services today than it did before the arrival of the casinos with all of their host fees and casino taxes. Now, the mayor was there, the head of economic development for the city, and the head of urban planning for the city of Bethlehem, participating in the conversation with Bryant, raising questions, responding to questions put by community members, as were representatives of the casino. Television, radio, and print journalists were all present, who reported not only on the dialogue that took place that day, but who have subsequently reported very systematically on all of the policy issues which emerged from the public forum and which we have been working on since then. Some of these issues include the need for the development of city policies to control real estate speculation. Some of these articles have dealt with the city's effort to deal with the problem of comps, complimentary food and drink at casinos, which is often responsible for driving businesses into bankruptcy. But interestingly, the most important thing, one of the issues that has emerged that's been most pressing, was the problem of racialized hiring practices at casinos. And it was very interesting. Brian Simon said, you know, one of the things y'all need to look out for is that in most casinos in most parts of the US, despite the fact that they're often located in minority communities, you end up with an all-white labor force, especially on the casino floor in the public areas. What was interesting is that this was the issue which community members, many of them African Americans and Latinos who were present at the forum, talked about having lived in Atlantic City and having been unable to get employment. Now, as a result of the issues that came up in the forum around these racialized hiring practices, we set up a working group to deal with this problem. The working group, in collaboration with a Center for Economic Development in the city, hosted a series of public forums that we started with 4 of them. There ultimately had to be 20 of them offered. Something like 7,000 people attended these forums, which provided accurate information about the security screening process, and in order to tell people how hiring would work and what they did or didn't need to fear about hiring jobs. It turned out that security screening was one of the principal mechanisms for racially segregating the workforce. Follow-up work by this working group, which has now been in existence for 2.5 years, this group is now doing follow-up work to find out the racial makeup of the workforce at the casino, and also to ascertain whether Southside residents actually got jobs, since that was one of the principal claims for the bringing in of the casino. In a subsequent Southside Initiative course, students in political science, economics, African American studies, and sociology studied the dynamics of racial discrimination in the American workplace today, using the casino hiring process as a sort of central case study with community members in the course. Out of that class now have come several published research papers. So today, we have students and faculty producing sophisticated academic research in collaboration with community members in ways that I hope enhances the ability both of local politicians and of the developers themselves to attend to issues of social justice, and in ways that foster more informed local media representation of these dynamics. Now, I know I've gone into a little bit of detail about this. I don't want to talk too much more about this Southside Initiative, except to say that using this same model, what we have done is to try to tackle a fairly wide range of issues affecting the city, not only issues having to do with community development. Much of our most intensive work has had to do with public history and public humanities in the city, and also with environmental justice, public health, and access to green space, all of which are issues of really pressing concern for people on the South Side. The most extraordinary thing, I think, for everybody who's participated in the initiative thus far has been the scale of participation. Faculty in virtually every wing of the university wanted to teach courses. Thousands of community members and members of the university community have participated in the activities of the initiative in one way or another. And what all of this is a testament to is the intensity of people's desire to overcome the forms of segregation that have characterized the city of Bethlehem over a very long period of time, even though there is very, very substantial distrust in the city on both sides of that divide. Okay, I want to now just say a few words about the broader vision of the research university that, at least for me, has emerged out of this enterprise. I'd like to propose that universities in our time can actually function as engines of democracy, and this is not a casual observation. Even as democracy remains a foundational value in our society, we live at a moment of widespread pessimism about effective, meaningful democracy in the United States. As low voter turnout and other indicators suggest, many Americans have very little faith in the electoral process. And even as ordinary people doubt their ability to influence Congress or state legislatures or city councils, it also remains true that most Americans have extraordinarily little experience actively deliberating and participating in collective decision-making about issues that immediately affect them, where they work, where they live, or where they learn. More than 40 years ago, the British cultural critic and political thinker Raymond Williams described democracy as a long revolution in Western societies. He insisted that even in the mid-20th century, we were then still at a very early stage in learning the practices and procedures of democracy, and that one of the most urgent tasks of our societies was to invent and cultivate such practices. My own experience in Bethlehem over the last 3 years has convinced me that universities can, if they choose, play an important role in this ongoing process. They can foster the production, preservation, and dissemination of knowledge about the most urgent problems we face locally as well as globally. They can bring people together, not merely students and teachers, but people throughout their wider communities to deliberate. Universities have resources, and above all, universities have stature and influence to bring government officials together with the people who have elected them, or, for example, to bring corporate developers together with the people whose community is in the process of transformation. They can disseminate knowledge more widely, more variously, and oddly enough, more locally than they currently do. And they can help make us more answerable to one another. Now, if universities wish to be engines of democracy in this sense, they will need to engage in what I have called practices of intellectual desegregation. They will need to overcome the barriers that so often separate them intellectually as well as socially, frequently by design, sometimes by accident, from the communities in which they are located. They will need to focus some of their intellectual resources, not all, but some, on the towns and cities of which they are a part, and they will want to enrich themselves by making as much space as they can for local forms of knowledge that have not yet made their way into established archives, classrooms, and research agendas. I'd like to end my talk today by saying a little bit about the book I've begun writing here at the Institute, a book that seeks to extend the practice of intellectual desegregation into the domain of my own research. Over the last 3 years, I have become increasingly aware that many of my neighbors, a quarter of whom, as I've told you, are living below the poverty line, are eager to understand how the city of Bethlehem has arrived at its current difficulties and what its social alternatives might be. I decided to write a book both for my neighbors and for scholars of American studies that might address some of these questions. The book will draw on the specialized forms of knowledge that I possess as a scholar of American social movements and also as a literary critic. More about the literature part in a moment. But it will also draw heavily on local forms of knowledge about the city derived, among other sources, from the extensive archive of oral history being compiled by the Southside Initiative. The book, provisionally entitled Bethlehem, American Utopia, American Tragedy, will trace the long arc of the city's history from its 18th century founding to its post-industrial present. The book treats Bethlehem as a microcosm of the nation, and it seeks above all to reveal the evolving economic, racial, and gendered power relations that have shaped life in the city over the whole of its 260-year history, but also to reveal the persistent egalitarian and democratic aspirations that have emerged in response to those structures of power. The book will tell the story of Bethlehem as a drama in 3 acts, focusing on the 3 phases of the city's history that I outlined at the start of this talk. This is sort of a kind of reminder to your memory. The first 2 slides obviously show you Moravian Bethlehem as it looks today, the steel site as it looks, and the casino. The first section will explore the paradoxes of 18th century Moravian Bethlehem, emphasizing both its egalitarian and communitarian accomplishments, which exceed what most Americans today believe to be possible. But it will also reveal the persistent ideological and economic pressures that ultimately undermined those accomplishments. The second section will tell the story of industrial Bethlehem, emphasizing its remarkable technological innovation and economic productivity, its harsh economic exploitation, and the democratic organizing that enabled ordinary working people to transform the city into a model of working-class prosperity for a time, and that also enabled the racial and gender integration of its major institutions. The third section will tell the paradoxical post-industrial tale of the casino in the brownfield, where slot machines have replaced the rolling mills. This is our America, ripe for democratic reinvention. The book will offer neither a conventional narrative or analytic history, but rather a kind of historical mosaic. It will consist entirely of very brief vignettes, ranging in length from a paragraph to a few pages, each of which seeks to capture an emblematic moment, a single moment in the city's history, to reveal a particular configuration of power or a representative aspiration. This unconventional form is derived from the modernist works of nonfiction, which I have explored in my recent literary scholarship, and about which I'll be happy to say more if people are interested in the question period. For now, I'll note that my aim is to produce a form of writing that is capable both of ambitious historical synthesis and that is also highly accessible. I'm seeking to produce an open form of writing that invites readers to ask large questions about the large structures of power that have shaped and often deformed this society, and about the aspirations for equality and democracy that have persisted and evolved, often in the face of failure, and that deserve to be cultivated. As you can perhaps see, this book pursues an unconventional formal experiment. It takes a risk. Its method rests on the notion that scholars in the social sciences have important things to learn from literature if we wish our most precious forms of knowledge to be widely disseminated beyond the boundaries of our specialized academic communities. The Institute has provided me with the luxury of time and freedom I needed to launch that experiment. I'd like to end my talk today by reading you one very short vignette, a brief excerpt from my book. It focuses on the modernist poet Hilda Doolittle, who published under the name H.D. H.D. was born and raised in the city of Bethlehem, and she's a central figure for the middle section of my book because her ancestors were among the original Moravian founders. Her father was a Lehigh professor, and she came of age just at the moment when the city was being reborn as an industrial immigrant steel town. She is one of the city's great utopian visionaries. She's a recurrent figure in the middle section of the book, and this is perhaps, what I'm about to read to you is perhaps one of maybe 5 or 6, at the moment, 6 vignettes that focus on her. This vignette is set in 1941, just as Bethlehem Steel was at the height of its wartime production and at the height of the struggle for unionization, though as you will see, it describes events that take place on the other side of the Atlantic. I'm concerned here, among other things, with the way in which a mid-20th century poet was struggling to realize imaginatively the betrayed egalitarian promises of her 18th century Moravian forebears. I'm trying here both to comment on a book which H.D. wrote in 1941 and also to capture something about the way in which these very large historical forces were lived by a person at this moment in a very intimate psychological way. So here it is. In the winter and spring of 1941, the expatriate poet Hilda Doolittle, H.D., was living in a small flat in London. For almost 100 consecutive days and nights, German warplanes rained down bombs upon the city. 1 million houses were destroyed, and 20,000 civilians died in London during the Blitz. Day after day, night after night, H.D. was haunted by the fear that she would be burned alive, buried in the rubble. her mind turned to childhood, to Bethlehem. She remembered that her beloved grandmother, Mamali, had also been afraid of fire all her life. She remembered, too, a story that Mamali had told her, had whispered to her, or perhaps her grandmother had been unable even to whisper it. In any event, the poet's imagination brought the vision to life. In the earliest days of Bethlehem, a band of Moravians met with a band of Lenape on a small island in the Monocacy Creek. That small strip of land, now vanished, was known to the Moravians as Wunden Island, the island of wounds. On Wunden Island, the Europeans and the native people of the valley made an ecstatic discovery. The Holy Spirit of the Moravians and the Great Spirit of the Lenape were one and the same. All human beings were spiritual kin, equal before God and before one another. Relinquishing distinctions of race, tribe, nation, and sect, they saw that all people were members of one common family, all should be included, all embraced within the beloved community. It appears that this meeting had been inspired and consecrated by two women. Anna von Palen agreed to join the Lenape, unbaptized though they were. Morning Star agreed to join the Moravian Brotherhood, despite their ignorance of her people's rituals. The women and men who met at Wunden Island accepted joyfully the gift of wisdom, and they promised to honor the gift. But others among the Moravians regarded the meeting as a blot upon the church and saw the pledge as a scandal. The stricter brethren of the church said it was witchcraft, and as those who had been at Wunden Island knew, and as Mamali and H.D. recalled, you can be burnt for a witch. So there was a promise and there was a gift, but the promise, it seems, was broken, and the gift, it seems, was lost. As Mamali knew, and as H.D. affirmed, there must be a penalty for breaking so profound a promise. There would be a curse upon the land. If the vision of equality and the promise of peace were repudiated, there would be great wars. And H.D. thought of the river of blood that had been flowing down through the generations. She thought of the massacre at Gnadenhütten. In 1755, 11 Moravians had been killed by Indians. In 1782, 96 Indians were killed by white men in a town of the same name. And she thought of the Indian skull that her father had collected during his pioneer youth and that he displayed on the bookcase of his study in Bethlehem. And she thought of her childhood fears of being scalped by savages. And she thought of her father, whose heart had been broken by his brother's pointless wartime death from typhoid fever and by the things he himself had seen and done during the Civil War, which had been fought because white people had for centuries enslaved millions of their black brothers and sisters on this continent. And she thought of her own brother Gilbert, who had died pointlessly on a battlefield in France in 1918, joining millions of other boys dead in the same senseless carnage. And now the bombs were falling day and night as Germans set out to kill English civilians and English bombers set out to kill Germans, even as the Germans were organizing to annihilate the Jews of Europe. As she huddled in fear in her London flat in the winter of 1941, H.D. thought about her family's inheritance. Her brother Gilbert, who lay in a soldier's grave in France, had inherited their father's pistol. Her brother Harold, a successful businessman, had inherited the mills and the steel and the devotion to profit. He inherited all this from their Uncle Hartley, who had worked so long for Bethlehem Steel, a corporation growing fabulously richer by the day, producing munitions that killed boys on battlefields and civilians in Berlin and London. And H.D. herself had inherited from her grandmother a vision of human equality and the peace that can only blossom from its recognition. She inherited, too, the fear of being burnt alive, a fear transmitted from mother to daughter, a fear that made the vision unspeakable. As the bombs fell night after night, H.D. confronted the terror that had silenced her mother and her mother's mother. The fear was no longer mysterious. She realized that she was afraid not of something nameless that might be done to her in future, but of a violence that had already been inflicted time and again. As she faced this fear, H.D. was suddenly free to give voice to the vision. In a book called The Gift, she wrote, "Our earth is a wounded island as we swing round the sun." Thank you. So, questions, comments? I know there are Bethlehem experts here, lifelong residents, people who have other things to offer. Questions?
This is sort of a two-part question, but I think the parts are related. First of all, casinos around the country are struggling with the current economic conditions. Some
Yes.
have gone bankrupt. First part of the question, how is this one doing? But I think more importantly, in terms of the community, the employment at casinos ranges from highly unskilled to highly specialized skilled people. Are they drawing on this community? Is the community benefiting employment-wise from this casino?
Yes. Excellent questions, enormously timely, both of them. The first question.
Can you repeat the question?
Yes, I'll be happy to. The two questions were, casinos are struggling all over the country. How's this one doing? And the second one is, have people benefited locally from the casino? Are they actually getting jobs, and what kind of jobs? The answer to the first question is casinos claimed that they were recession-proof. And one thing I want to emphasize to all of you, something you may not understand, casinos are big business in the United States and around the world. The man who owns this casino was the 11th richest man in the world. I was astounded to discover that over half of the largest campaign contributors to national political campaigns are casinos, more than pharmaceutical companies. This came as a source of utter astonishment to me. The casinos claimed that they were recession-proof, and it turned out they weren't. The Las Vegas Sands Corporation, which spent $700 million building the slot machine parlor, has recently said that they wouldn't do it again if they had understood the financial ramifications of the situation. They also, rumors are now circulating that they are trying to sell it. As you might guess, trying to find somebody who wants to buy that is not easy. So the question of the fate of the casino is a question of deep concern. The other thing is the casino promised, when they arrived, that they would do a whole lot of development on the steel site. And as soon as the recession hit, they announced that there would be no more building. They wouldn't even complete the hotel complex that was associated with it. So many of us are very, very concerned about the question of whether it's a viable business enterprise and what the future holds. One of the reasons that our working group is working on this problem of employment is it's absolutely at the core of what it means for the city. What is clear is that the high-paid casino jobs have all gone to outsiders. All of those people have been brought in mostly from Las Vegas. As far as we can ascertain, there's not a single professional job at the casino that comes from somebody in Bethlehem. The question of whether Southside residents, and one of the things I didn't tell you is that the Southside today is very heavily Puerto Rican and Dominican, whether Southside residents have even gotten the lowest level jobs in the casino is very, very unclear. The preliminary information, the casino has been very reluctant to participate in the analysis of what's actually happened. Certainly there have been some jobs, and the people who have them are extraordinarily glad to have those jobs. One of the most heartbreaking experiences I had since I got to Bethlehem was talking to men and women in their 80s and in some cases their 90s who had lost their Bethlehem Steel pensions and health plans, who were trying to get jobs as maids and custodians at the casino. So my answer is, on both counts, I don't know. But one of the things certainly that the university can do is to conduct research so that people actually have facts rather than myths and rumors on both sides. And so I hope that we will be able to provide better information.
The problems of a post-industrial society are not unique
No.
to Bethlehem, either nationally or internationally.
No.
Are there any communities in the world, and particularly in the United States, that you think have addressed the problem better than Bethlehem has?
Now, one thing I have to do is to express considerable humility about even trying to answer this question, because I know for a fact that there are people in the audience here who are professional sociologists who probably, and economists who probably have better answers to this question than I do. What I will say about it is that Bethlehem has pursued a strategy like some other post-industrial communities, one strategy that has been relatively common. And the claim has been that there are some places that have executed this strategy successfully, which is to convert a formerly industrial city into a kind of post-industrial knowledge economy based on entertainment and tourism and history. And one of the original ideas was that the casino would be one component of that, that there would be a massive museum to commemorate industrial history, that Bethlehem would be the place in the world to actually understand what industrial work was like, is like, and the history of American industry, and that there would be a whole sort of thriving kind of arts and entertainment kind of complex, that this vast steel site would be turned into such a thing. What I do know is that in Germany, in the Ruhr Valley, which was very heavily steel dominated, this enterprise was pursued very, very aggressively. And because the German government invested vast sums of money in the transformation of former steel plants, amazingly enough, into arts facilities and performing arts spaces, some of these have been enormously successful. One question is, without vast governmental investment, can such a thing be done? What I have to say is the early going isn't looking too optimistic for the reasons that have to do with the casino is not thriving. Whether the end of the recession will change that, I don't know. What I know, or one of the things that I believe, is that Bethlehem can become a place with a kind of cultural vitality which is based on its honoring of the remarkable history and current reality of its neighborhoods, which will make it an exceptionally attractive place to live. Whether that can begin to answer the question of where the jobs come from, that I don't know.
Where in relationship to the south side is Artworks and the Banana Factory?
It's just a few blocks away. The Banana Factory is and this was this was an enterprise that preceded in fact, it preceded even the collapse of Bethlehem Steel, but it certainly preceded this casino development. There were arts entrepreneurs in Bethlehem who early on wanted to see the city move in the direction of becoming a kind of culture and arts center. And its proximity to New York City and its proximity to Philadelphia, they thought would make that possible. And there's been an enormously vibrant, small-scale sort of artistic flourishing. And there's a massive summer music festival called Music Fest, which is associated with the Banana Factory, which has been enormously profitable. And the proposal was that at one end of the steel site, once the casino came in, there would be a massive flourishing of these activities, because the claim was that the casino was going to make so much money, they would provide large-scale resources. And many promises were made of this kind, that the casino would make that happen. Pretty much from the day the papers were signed, those commitments pretty much have evaporated. And there's, at present, no very serious discussion. The arts entrepreneurs responsible, though, for that enterprise are working very hard on their own account to produce the funding they want to create those facilities. So it may still happen.
So it really doesn't help the south side, though, that much.
It's a very, very substantial issue. One of the things that many and the class politics of that are very, very interesting, because one question is, would a culture and arts economy in a post-industrial city be committed to the production of culture which is meaningful to the people who live there? Or is it committed to the production of culture which is mainly of interest to people from outside the city, but who may have substantial resources? And that's not a simple question to answer. I mean, I think everybody in the room would probably agree that there's a complicated set of trade-offs there. But at the moment, I would say that most people on the south side don't see how that's going to speak to their immediate economic needs.
The closest analog
Mm.
was Lowell, Massachusetts.
Mm.
Lowell rebuilt itself around the heritage of its mill workers and the history of the mill towns, and successfully established a thriving museum culture. And I think if you're looking for analogs, that would be a particularly effective one. The second point I wanted to make, though, is that when casinos are the anchor point and when they thrive because they are encouraging people to spend their money in ways that are socially very destructive for them. And so my concern about anchoring redevelopment with a casino is that, it certainly provides jobs. The tourist industry in general is a very labor-intensive industry, and that's all to the good, but it's providing those jobs by providing opportunities mainly for low-income people to throw their money away.
Yes. Two quick responses to this. Did people hear the comment, or would people like me to repeat it? Can you raise your hand if you'd like me to repeat what the last comment? No, okay. The two quick comments. We brought in the leading experts on Lowell, Massachusetts, because it's been touted as many of you here know, Lowell was probably the first full-scale industrial center in the United States, had textile industries quite early in the 18th century. And those textile industries collapsed relatively early, and they worked very, very hard and with enormous sophistication to produce highly sophisticated museums about that experience. One of the things which was extraordinary, I would say some of the most moving public forums we had were when we brought to Bethlehem the people who had built the Lowell museums and a woman named Kathy Stanton, who's an anthropologist who has studied the Lowell experiment. What all of the people who have studied it have said is the same thing, and it's an interesting and very complicated story. Industrial history museums who goes to industrial history museums? The people who go to industrial history museums are professional class, highly educated people who want in some way to get in touch with the working class experience of their parents or grandparents, overwhelmingly. In almost every case, and very painfully, this happened in Lowell. Ironically, what happens is the current working class population of the city, in the case of Lowell, they were Hmong immigrants, have no relation to the former industry. The museums are constructed as spaces which are welcoming to professional class people and end up becoming kind of gated enclaves, which are not only not of use to the working class population, but often leave them to feel very, very painfully somehow excluded. And one of the things which was extraordinary was that when the people who built Lowell, who are heartbroken about these dynamics at their own museum, what's been very, very interesting was the set of conversations which this produced on the South Side about what kind of history, what kind of institution from public history would not make that happen. It is, however, true that Lowell has been quite successful, the museums have been quite successful financially. And so Lowell is a great accomplishment, and some of its limitations, I think, are as important for people trying to do this now as its strengths. On the subject of the destructive effects of the casino economy, all I'll say is absolutely. What you said is deeply true, and the single biggest demographic of who goes to casinos, there are two. Elderly people, particularly women, who are shut in their houses and experience it as a form of entertainment which is safe for them to participate in, and unemployed working class men who are liable to get into desperate financial trouble. And the potential economic ramifications, particularly for that demographic in the city, are very, very grave.
What happened to Lehigh Valley was supposed to be a new technological center, and I haven't heard anything. Whatever happened to that?
Lucent Technology moved to the valley. They became momentarily the second largest employer in the valley, and they pulled out 8 months later as a result of the collapse of the dot-com bubble. Like many post-industrial places, the idea that they would become the new Silicon Valley was much discussed. And unfortunately, the sort of Lucent moment came and went in the blink of an eye. The question of whether that can be pursued in other ways is something lots and lots of people are working on to figure out. But that was a sort of heartbreaking episode. Other questions? Yes.
Why did the Germans in the 18th century decide to privatize your town?
It's a wonderful and quite poignant story. The city of Bethlehem had this, as I described to you, this entirely communal economy, which was hugely successful in the ways that I described. When the patron of the entire international church, a guy named Count Ludwig von Zinzendorf, died, the new leadership in the church came to the conclusion that the international church had significant debts. Bethlehem was not only self-sustaining, but highly profitable. The people in the international church were convinced that if they privatized the community, they would produce more money, which the church could use to pay off its debts. They also had a very deep suspicion about the emancipation of women, the fact that women were functioning not only as ministers, but as cardinals ordaining female ministers, and that women were exercising these leadership roles made them very anxious, and they were very eager to see the city return to a more conventional nuclear family. But the economic motive appears to have been the dominant one. They were convinced that Bethlehem would become much more profitable if it were privatized. It was sort of a kind of Thatcherism in the 18th century. And at least in Bethlehem, the effects were devastating. So that's the short answer to the story.
Do some of the lessons learned from the South Side Initiative are being applied in Philadelphia, for example?
Yes, and there's a couple of things I should say. I was aware, because I was trying to do so much in the talk, one of the things I neglected to say, which I should certainly have said, this kind of work we are doing is being done at many, many institutions all over the place, and there are places that I know a lot about and places I probably don't know about, which I need to learn more about. As it happens, Penn has been in some ways a leader in this area. Penn has the oldest center, a thing called the Netter Center, which is now almost 35 years old, which has been trying to do this work in a very thoughtful and self-conscious way. Penn had a particularly serious problem, as many of you know, the problem of urban collapse, and the problems that this was creating for the university were very severe. So Penn has actually the longest track record of any place I know well in doing this kind of work. Interestingly, the Penn model, which is the most common model I know, is led by, and this is true at Penn, the people who are most active are experts in public policy and places where there are large schools of education. And the reason for this is that places that have public policy schools and schools of education, they have a much longer history and have procedures much more actively accustomed to integration into the lives of their immediate communities. What's interesting is that if you take a place like Lehigh, some of the things which are distinctive about what we're doing have to do with the fact that the initiative was really started above all in the social sciences and the humanities, and the result of which it doesn't have a sort of professional school emphasis. And there are weaknesses that come from that. We would do our work much better if we had public policy experts. But I also think that some of the way the process works is different at places like Lehigh. There are also small liberal arts colleges which have worked very hard in this way and have really done quite remarkable things. And so I certainly wouldn't want to give you the impression, oh, you know, Lehigh is doing this, nobody else is doing it, which is far from the case. Does this mean my time is at hand? Okay. Well, thank you all for your attention and for your great questions.